You're listening to Three Things to Know with Stephanie Haney, with experts and insiders on what you need to know in Northeast Ohio.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Three Things to Know podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Haney. I am thrilled to have you here for another important conversation. And this one is going to get a little bit uncomfortable, but I do mean that in a good way because this is an important conversation to have now. You may be wondering, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, why are we always talking about difficult things? A couple weeks ago, I was talking about how we were going to have a taboo conversation that was all around money and finances and all of that good stuff. Well, because it's important to do. We have to have these difficult conversations. I don't mean to make it awkward, but sometimes it is awkward, and we might as well just get awkward together and get used to it. So today, the conversation that we're going to be having is around a buzzword that you may have been hearing a lot lately, particularly since this summer. And that word is anti-racist and anti-racism. And in that context, we will be talking about how we can be better allies and the importance of that work. Now, why are we talking about this today? Well, there are some pretty serious objective truths to the world that we live in. First of all, black men are more likely than white men to be killed at the hands of police. That's an objective truth. We witnessed that firsthand many times, but particularly this summer on May 25th, when George Floyd was killed at the hands of white police officers in Minneapolis, one in particular who is now facing a murder charge that will be beginning soon. Another objective truth. Black women are more likely than white women to die in childbirth. Another objective truth. People of color have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic that we are all facing right now, in part because fewer people of color have the privilege of working from home to stay safe, and also because of healthcare disparities that exist for people of color. Now, those are just a few examples of racism that are ingrained in our culture. So we're talking about this today to help dismantle that racism bit by bit. And like I said, it's going to get a little bit uncomfortable. That's okay, because when we get uncomfortable, that's when we can grow. That's when we see the opportunities that are there to do work, to learn where we fall short, to better understand other people's perspectives, and do better and be better. And we need to start by knowing what the heck it is that we're talking about here. So we're going to start at the most basic level of trying to understand what it means to be anti-racist. What is anti-racism? This will hopefully be the first of many conversations that we get to have here around the issue of racial equality. And by the way, I want to make very clear, I know I was talking about some objective truths when it comes to the Black experience and then the experience generally of people of color. This is not just a white and Black thing, because racism impacts different groups in unique ways, and also individuals within those groups in unique ways, because not everyone's experience is the same just because you fall under some overarching category that we have basically created. But you have to start somewhere, and this is a starting point. So to help us get in the know about that, my guest today is Evelyn Burnett. She is the founder of Northeast Ohio's most recent racial equity and inclusion and anti-racism movement. She started her work at the Cleveland Neighborhood Progress Organization, and then that evolved into programming that's now available at a place called ThirdSpace Action Lab here in Northeast Ohio. ThirdSpace Action Lab holds monthly anti-racism workshops where thousands of Northeast Ohioans have actually taken those programs, along with people around the world. So let's bring her in now. Evelyn, thank you for making time for us on the Three Things to Know podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
In this conversation that the nation seems to be having right now about racial inequity, we keep hearing the words anti-racist and anti-racism over and over. They might not necessarily be brand new terms, but we're hearing them a lot more now. Why do you think that is?
First, really excited to be here with you and have this really important conversation. I think we're hearing it more now because America is experiencing a racial reckoning as some of us are describing it, right? We have hundreds of years of history, much of which has been quite romanticized. You know, we don't learn about the history of racism and systemic racism, oppression, white supremacy. Those are not words that we are comfortable with as a society. They are not words and concepts that we have spent a lot of time in our K through 12 or even some of our collegiate or postgraduate educations learning about. But we continue to see certain groups of people suffer in certain ways. And we continue to see these flashpoints in society, like the death of Ahmaud Arbery, or the death of Breonna Taylor, or the death at the hands of the police by George Floyd. So you often hear someone say something like, since the death of George Floyd, right? There aren't many Americans who haven't had a conversation that starts that way. And so I think because of that, like, we are hearing more about not just kind of what's wrong, but what we want people to be. And anti-racist or anti-racism, I think, is a term that is starting to reemerge into our lexicon, but it's certainly not a new term.
Because it is something that is reemerging now, and a lot of people might be hearing it for at least what they think is the first time, at least what they recall is the first time, I'd like to start if we could just broadly define that. And a big question that comes up sometimes is, what is the difference between being anti-racist and not being racist?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought about this a lot when I received, when I was thinking about our conversation together. I think it's first important to understand what racism is in and of itself, right? The first thing I will tell you is that being anti-racist or anti-racism is not just about what we are against, but what we are for. But I think it's important to take a step back before you can talk about being anti-racist, to understand, like, what is race? What is racism? A lot of folks are surprised to learn and understand and wrestle with the fact that race is a social construct. It's a racial categorization. It's not a biological fact, right? And importantly, that race designations have changed over time. People have to understand that history in America, right? When Jews and Italians and the Irish came to America, they were not designated racially as white. And so the shape of these racial categorizations, they change and they evolve over time. We see that happen primarily, but through the census, but in many facets of society. But we have to break down, like, what is racism? Racism for us is race prejudice and social and institutional power. Racism is a system of advantage that is based on race. It is a system of oppression that is based on race, which makes it a white supremacy system. And I know that's a lot sort of for a podcast, right? But like, before we can get to, like, is it about me? Is it about systems? We have to understand, like, what the thing is first. And so, like, how can you participate individually, or how can we combat racism collectively? I think, real quick, it's important that we understand that racism isn't simply about individual acts of meanness or bigotry, but it is in fact a system. It is structural, and it is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various ways that reinforce or perpetuate racial inequity, right? And those things live through dimensions of history and culture, and have a lot to do with our notions and understanding of whiteness, right? So these are things that are wickedly complex and not easy to kind of understand in some of the passing conversations that make us uncomfortable when we just kind of step back. So it's a lot of kind of digging and awareness building that I think people have to do before they can even arrive at, like, what is anti-racism, and what does it mean for me to be anti-racist?
And I think a lot of times you get to that uncomfortable moment in a conversation like that because people want to be very protective and defensive of the way that they're perceived. They want to think, well, I haven't done this thing. I'm not racist. I don't have a problem with people of other races, but it really is so much bigger than that. So to really kind of hammer this point home again as best we can, and in saying this, I want to preface this by saying I do not mean to imply that racism is passive. Because it's certainly not. There's a lot of action that's happening there. But there are instances where we could be in a situation where you're not being actively racist per se. You're not doing something. You're not necessarily taking an action, but you're also not being anti-racist. Can you talk to me about what some of those situations might look like?
Yeah. Before I go into that, the one thing that I wanted to say is that the depth of understanding that people need to like make those distinctions requires a lot of study. So there's literally a book called How to Be an Antiracist by Ibram Kendi, right? It's a New York Times bestseller. And it's, a couple hundred pages of like, what is this and how do you participate? And again, really drives home this point that it's not just about what we're against, but what we're for. And that does begin to speak to some of our individual acts. But to answer your question more directly, there are all these components that we learn about in, diversity and inclusion trainings or workshops, or racial equity and inclusion trainings or workshops, one that we offer at least monthly here in the community, and we can talk about that later. But this idea of passive and active, a lot of people are familiar with the concept, for example, of unconscious bias. Right? This idea that you can do things and they're just unconscious to you. You don't know that they're happening. And I don't want to diminish in any way the personal responsibility, right? That like you can do things or not do things that perpetuate racism. You can do those things unconsciously, right? And those things can happen in very overt and covert ways. So some of those small ways in everyday conversations is just like, things that you might ask about a person's hair or background, or things that you might insinuate about their neighborhoods. I was just talking to a gentleman who was wanting to do some work with our firm after he learned a little bit about what we do. And he wanted to put a museum up or an exhibit from a museum in Alabama up in Cleveland. They do like a traveling exhibit. And he said that he had been advised that, that exhibit should go in the neighborhoods, like in one of the neighborhoods. And he said, but people like me would never come to Glenville. Well, I live in Glenville. I live in Glenville. I run my business from Glenville. I'm very proud about being in Glenville. In that moment, I didn't feel like he was being racist, right? I think he was just unaware of something that he needed to get some more proximity to, which is something that we talk about a lot in our work, is the importance of proximity, because most of us are trying to understand this thing from afar, right? Most of us are like making these assumptions about places and people, importantly, that we have very little proximity to, we don't know very much about. And so there's those things every day. You're hard pressed to find a Black or brown person who hasn't been in some conversation where you're asking yourself that question, like, is this racist or is this not racist? And those are things that we should interrogate. But really, in our work, what we're more concerned about are the bigger ways that folks contribute to racism. For example, redlining is a practice, right, that has greatly shaped communities across the country. And unfortunately, I think that people still think about redlining as a past practice, but redlining is alive and well today. Right? So you can instigate redlining or perpetuate redlining as a mortgage lender at a bank, or as an auto lender at a car dealership, or by like not coming to a place. So there, we are concerned for sure about these individual unconscious acts, but we're also equally, if not more, concerned about the structural and systemic ways that racism exists. So people have to kind of think about both. Like, in what ways am I doing this that I may not be aware of? What conversations am I avoiding? And then what ways do I contribute to the structural nature and systemic nature of racism? I'll say this really quickly because I think it's important, especially since last summer's uprising and importantly since the insurrection. A few weeks ago, a lot of my closest colleagues and dearest friends have said, like, oh man, I feel terrible about this. I can't believe that this is us. This is not who we are, those sorts of things. And, I've got this one crazy uncle, and it's, I can't, the Thanksgiving table or the holiday table is going to be tough. And what I've been telling my white colleagues and friends is, like, if you can't talk to your crazy uncle, like, we're not there, our ability to do something about this is significantly limited. And I also remind folks that, like, white folks are not the only people that have a crazy uncle, right? And also that uncomfortable conversations about race and racism are not limited to white folks, right? I have uncomfortable conversations about race and racism with my family as well, because Black people are not a monolith. And so we don't all share the same views about race or racism or what's happening to the country. So a lot of this really comes down to courage and will, and our ability to embrace some of our discomfort, to have conversations that allow us to learn and begin to think about our own actions individually and collectively.
One thing I just want to touch on very quickly for anyone who might not be aware, redlining generally, very generally speaking, just the process of denying people loans, giving them predatory lending rates, really keeping a certain group of people out of a subdivision, maybe preventing them from getting that car, that kind of thing. So just for anyone who might not be aware what that is. And I wanted to speak to something that you were talking about that person you had that experience with who maybe didn't realize what they were saying when they were talking about bringing that exhibit potentially to Glenville. Mm-hmm. For example, I am a white woman. Mm-hmm. There may be times, there are times, there will be times when I do something that perpetuates racism without realizing it. Mm-hmm. So what I want to talk to a little bit now is the difference between intent and outcome and how that factors into anti-racism.
Yeah, the intent outcome conundrum is really tricky. Mm-hmm. What I remind folks of is that you can hurt or kill people mm-hmm. despite your best intentions, right? I think that the work of anti-racism, intentions play a relatively small part of that, right? Because mm-hmm. It's really not about our intentions, right? You have teachers, you have lawyers, you have doctors, you have folks all throughout society that do not intend to go into their places of work and harm anyone. They want to be a good teacher, they want to be a good doctor, they want to be a good lawyer, and yet third grade reading and your zip code continue to significantly dictate the outcomes of Black and brown children's lives, right? Mm-hmm. Cleveland and Cuyahoga County continue to have some of the highest rates of infant mortality in the country that is comparable to third world countries. It is the highest in Cleveland in the 6 neighborhoods that surround University Circle. So the 6 neighborhoods that surround Cleveland Clinic and University Hospitals and Case Western Reserve University, right? These world-class institutions these neighborhoods have the highest rates of infant mortality and, importantly, maternal morbidity, mm-hmm. right? So it's not necessarily about the doctors and the other professionals inside of those buildings' intentions. And I think that to go on a little bit more there, our infant mortality rate, for those that don't know, Black women with advanced degrees or higher, so master's degrees or higher, are far more likely to lose their own life or their baby's life in childbirth than a white woman without a high school diploma.
Wow.
right? And in some cases, it's 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 times higher, right? So someone like me, who's master's educated, and I'm primed to be a wife and to be a mom. Those are things that I think about every day, right? Like, based on the knowledge that I have, like, is this the right decision for my life? Like, that's how serious these things are. And those aren't, about Stephanie's intentions, right? It's about like the structural nature of this problem that we are uncomfortable even talking about in America. And there's a history and a legacy that, like, again, goes far beyond just the intentions of people, good or bad, right? That, like, when we have conversations with each other and we say things like, why are we still talking about slavery? That was a long time ago. There's a history and legacy, right? That, like, is compounded as time goes on, because, like, racism remakes itself, which is what makes it so dangerous, that in slavery, and during times of slavery, which was very long, right? And shaped who we are as a country. It looked one way, and it looked another way in Reconstruction, and it looked another way in Jim Crow, and it looked another way in civil rights, and, like, it looks another way today. But there's, like, an important through line that people have to understand. So I think the intentions versus outcome, again, conundrum is something that folks just really have to push past to understand that it's really not about, you wanting, it's not only about you wanting more or better or not having animus towards people, but the ways that all of us really subconsciously contribute to upholding the system of racism in America.
And to speak to the fact that one element of what makes people uncomfortable about this is that sort of cedes a little bit of control over the situation. If you're not, I mean, we do certainly have control over the fact that we can educate ourselves, we've got access to information, and in that way, but that can be something that's difficult people to come to terms with, that I didn't mean to do this thing. Why am I feeling like a bad person or feeling in not a great way because of it? And that is exactly as you said, that's just something we've got to just get over. And there's work to be done there, and I don't mean to minimize it. I know that's tough work to do, is to, quote, get over that, but it is part of what needs to be done.
Absolutely.
And that brings me to a conversation about blind spots. Those are a real thing. And as I said, we do have more access to information than we ever have before. But on another level, we don't know what we don't know. We've got to be introduced to it some way, somehow. Hopefully we can be proactive about that. Hopefully we can present ourselves in situations where we're seeing things that are outside of our norm so we can become more acclimated. But one thing that your programs talk about is sharing the same language. And an example that comes to mind for me is the term BIPOC. And I will be the first to admit, when I first saw that term, I thought we were talking about LGBTQ plus situation here and people of color. I did not know that it stood for Black, Indigenous, people of color. So with that in mind, I would like to talk about some of the important terms that you think that we should really know to kind of get these conversations started.
Yeah, interestingly, the BIPOC terminology is quite new for a lot of people, including people of color, right? Like this, and really the extent of my understanding, because I'm still learning about BIPOC as well, right? As a person who does this every day, it's about the naming of folks, right? It's about not just lumping all people of color into sort of one group, because people of color are not having the same, all people of color are not having the same experiences in America and in our communities, right? And this is a topic that's tough to talk about sort of in a short amount of time, but in our workshops, we really lay out in great detail through the Racial Equity Institute that disparities across all systems in society, and particularly American society. White folks are always doing the best. Their outcomes are always the best, which importantly doesn't mean that their outcomes are good. It just means their outcomes are the best in the system. And Black is always the worst in every system in American society. And other racial groups toggle in between depending on the system, right? So like the outcomes that Asian Americans may be experiencing in educational attainment looks different than what they might be experiencing in terms of health outcomes. right? But the bookends are always Black and white. And like understanding the terms that get us there is essential. I think it goes beyond just understanding what BIPOC means, right? Black, Indigenous persons of color. We don't talk very much about Indigenous people as an example in America. In Cleveland, it's all about the tribe, right? Like, are we going to change the name or not?
Right.
But really understanding the history and legacy of Indigenous people in America has been wildly romanticized. And unfortunately, it's been romanticized since we were little teeny kids, right? We watched the story of Pocahontas and think it was a beautiful love story. It was not, right? Like, that's the Disney version of that story. And it really, solidified some very important and tragic, really, alliances and designations through that marriage, which again was not a love story. But I think to riff a little bit more on the BIPOC, for me, it is about and why the language and the lexicon are so important is, like I mentioned at the outset, to help us articulate not just what we are against, but what we're for. Right. So when it comes down to the distribution of resources, as an example, or like the support and help that we're going to apply to various communities, or, the places where we want to put our advocacy support or like policy priorities, it is essential that we are able to name the extent that a group is suffering, right? Or like what their outcomes look like, so we can apply our interventions appropriately. And so again, using BIPOC, if we just lump everybody into one category, and we see that in the criminal justice system here in Cleveland, for example, that Black folks are having 9 times more negative outcomes than white folks, and 6 times more than Latinos, and 8 times more than Asian Pacific Islanders, then we shouldn't be applying, right, our intervention the same. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the one thing that we haven't talked about so far that's important is the notion of anti-blackness, right? Like what it means, how it is instigated, and our ability to name anti-blackness even among other people of color. Right? Because it is distinct from the oppression that other people of color experience, again, helps us to understand things like Black Lives Matter, right? And why Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that anybody else's life doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. It means that often in our society, and right here in Cleveland, when we start to talk about race, when we start to talk about the oppression of Black people, for example, people say things like, well, what about LGBTQ people? And well, what about like Latinos? So our ability to stomach that discomfort about Black people is significantly limited in our society. And so like the language, which is very new for a lot of folks and quite uncomfortable for a lot of folks, is like just work that we have to do. I mentioned this at the outset, and when we say words like white supremacy, mm-hmm. White supremacy isn't about like just the KKK, right? And like extremist groups. White supremacy is the structure of the society that we live in. It means that the value gap is that white folks are more valued in our society, right? That's like pretty heady stuff for people, especially if we don't even have the ability or the stick-to-itiveness to understand what this means, that it's not just about people climbing over the walls of the Capitol, but that white supremacy is among us every single day of our lives in America. So I'll stop there. I could go on forever.
Well, and that's a great point too. And I think there are a lot of things that people don't think about. So for example, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what some other blind spots might be. When you talk about how white supremacy can be pervasive, I think it would be really meaningful here just to share a couple of instances. For example, if you're looking at scanning devices.
Yes.
If you go to wash your hands in a bathroom and it's one of those automatic dispensers for paper towels, There have been instances where people with darker colored skin haven't been able to activate those paper towel dispensers because they were designed by white people and they pick up on the lighter skin tone and things like that. So those are just some of the things that white people can take for granted every single day. And, you know, not to trivialize it, that's obviously, there are many, many other instances of that, but that's just one example that I think can be really visual for people. And so we've talked about language. What are some other blind spots that you think might become a barrier for people who are trying to become proactively anti-racist?
I think the biggest blind spot is the belief that there is a quick fix, you know, or a silver bullet, or a one-sheeter, or a panacea on ending racism. And we combat that literally every single day in our work, right? People come to our 3-hour groundwater workshop, and these again are presented by the Racial Equity Institute, our 2-day even phase 1 workshop, which goes much deeper and like helps folks understand history and do some exercises to unpack some of these concepts and terms and ideologies and beliefs. And we've been doing this since 2015, and I've not been to the session yet where, whether it's 1 hour or 6 hours into those workshops, someone says like, all right, I get it. Just tell me what to do, right? White people have some work to do, right? You have some conversations to have with each other. White people have to stop going to Black people and brown people and asking them what to do. Right? Like, you have to spend some time. And that's why I really encourage people to like practice with your crazy uncle, right? That's your mom or your dad's brother, or, you know, like that's a person that you love. So like practicing just having these conversations, which is another blind spot. If folks are just waiting on the thing to do, that is I think more than a blind spot to think that like we're going to see change or transformation in our society if there is not work to be done on behalf of or by all people. I think another blind spot is sort of not acknowledging or understanding the frankly unfair labor on the persons of color around us, right? So when we're at work and George Floyd is killed, or, you know, Breonna Taylor is killed, and you're talking to like your Black friend and wanting them to like explain all of these things for you, it's kind of like acknowledging that that's not what they come to work for. They came to work for the same reasons you came to work. And so like placing that responsibility on someone who may be a colleague or even a friend can be very tricky, and it can be difficult for the relationship because the reverse isn't usually happening, right? The reverse, you know, people aren't coming and saying, Stephanie, can you explain to me why white people do this, or why white people do that, or why people are so uncomfortable having this conversation, right? Like it's not a two-way dialogue. And so those are some of the blind spots that I see, that we think that we can end this quickly, that we think that we can end this without discomfort, that we think that we can end this just because like we are well-intentioned. Like those things, I think serve as that we don't have to study, that we don't have to read or listen to podcasts like this one, right? That there's not, and that it will happen fast. Like we didn't get here quickly. We're not going to get out of here quickly, right? But there are certainly some steps that we can take to get there. It's a couple more things that just made me think of. Another blind spot is to overly intellectualize this work, and that's usually when people are like going through workshops and those things. Like there is a need in our culture for like more and more data. Right? Like I need another study, I need another report. And so we kind of like overly intellectualize it. And we don't think about how does racism and oppression and injustice make us feel, right? So we tell people, you got to get out of your head a little bit and like get to your heart, because there's certainly a blind spot to get stuck in that, like trying to make meaning of it. And I got to tell you, for me, I just can't make meaning of some of the things that human beings do to each other. And some of the things that human beings do to each other over such a sustained period of time, right? Like it's just no sense making in that. But But that's what we often try to do. And we think we have to spend more time understanding how these things make us all feel. And I want to make sure to say this directly to your listeners and your audience, that if white people, and this is probably the biggest blind spot, or I would actually call it pitfall. Mm-hmm. If white people are approaching the work of anti-racism or trying to be an anti-racist for Black people or for brown people, it's not going to work. If white people don't spend the time understanding how racism and injustice and oppression impacts their own lives, their own souls, the futures of their own of your own children, doing it for Black folks contributes to how we got here. I got to tell you, right after the uprisings in June, I was interviewed. It didn't make the cut, but a reporter put a mic in my face and said, "What do you want white people to do?" And I said, "Leave us alone, please." Mm-hmm. Leave us alone, right? Like, we just want to wake up every day and go about our day without fear of losing our lives, of losing our children's lives, of being discriminated against in these subtle and overt ways, right? Like, just leave us alone. Like, please stop studying us to death without action, right? Or without intervention, and understand what you as a white person get out of an anti-racist society or an anti-racist world, because it cannot be only for people of color.
Mm-hmm. There are so many things that I want to respond to in what you said there. I mean, that was a mind-blowing moment right there when you said that a big pitfall is thinking about anti-racism as something you do for non-white people. Mm-hmm. That's powerful. That speaks to the world that we all live in and that we all want to be a part of, and how it does impact our everyday lives. And let me just also say, too, what you mentioned about making sense of things, mm-hmm. It blows my mind. And again, I know that I, as a white person, fall short. I know that there are times where I do things that perpetuate racism. Best intentions, as we talked about, aside, mm-hmm. It blows my mind that we live in a world where at one point in time, people had the audacity to think that they could control other humans. Mm-hmm. And that is just mind-blowing. And that is something that I don't think anyone could ever make any sense of. You can, hear people's justifications about it, power struggles and that sort of thing, but it just doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So,
and it's important to think about the ways that we continue to do that today, mm-hmm. right? We talk a lot in our work about creativity, and the importance of the radical imagination. And radical is another one of those words that some of us here are like, oh, what does that mean, right? But really what it means is, like, we've never seen an anti-racist, racially equitable, racially inclusive America. We've never seen it. It is a desired future state. And it doesn't mean that we haven't made progress, because we've made a lot of progress, in fact, right? But it's why I tell people I'm not an expert on racial equity. I'm not an expert on anti-racism, because, and I don't think anyone is, because we haven't seen that yet. But in order to get there, right? And this is what complicates the question about, like, well, what do we do? In order to get there, we're going to have to be very, very creative, and we're going to have to imagine the future that we want to see. It's why I've recently, at the years-long urging of my business partner Mordecai, have started to get into Afrofuturism. What does a different future look like? I think it's why when Black folks are talking about Wakanda, it was so exciting and uplifting for people, because it's like, wow, this is very different than what I have known my whole life. And I think about and this is an example we share a lot in our work, the audacity, right? The imagination it had to take a slave whose parents were slaves and grandparents and great-grandparents and 10 generations before them were slaves, to say, I don't know what's on the other side of that fence or that field, but I'm going there. I don't know what's out there. There's no case study. There's no work plan. There's no one-sheeter, but I am going. right? And to think about somebody like Harriet Tubman, who I think we've begun to trivialize her life and legacy because it's about, is she going on the $20 bill or not? That this is a person who had creativity and imagination to say, like, this is going to end for people, and to go back time and time and time again, and risk her life time and time and time again in pursuit of freedom, right? And so it's just, again, and it's not to trivialize it, but it's like, to find the courage and the will and the audacity and the creativity and the radical imagination to get there requires effort from us all, right? Not just Black people or brown people or oppressed people, but all of us, right? And so I think it's why I was so excited to talk to you, because I think doing what you're doing is so important, right? Just like having a conversation and acknowledging that, like, hey, like, I mess up too, right? I say things and do things that, like, oh man, is that like, am I doing no harm here? Is that making things better? Is it making things worse? But I do think that such an important first step of our work is doing exactly what we're doing right now. Just like having a conversation, assuming positive, unconditional intent, knowing that our words and tone can hurt and cut deep, right? But those things should not limit us from starting these important dialogues in our community.
I just need to say, when you were talking about the audacity of imagining what's on the other side of that fence, I got chills.
Oh,
I really did. I got chills. And that's what we need. We need that radical imagination. That is, I love that phrase. I just do. Now, when we were emailing about talking today, something that you mentioned was the fact that training is so important. And of course, that's a lot of the work that you do at the Third Action Space Lab. And you mentioned that it's important because being impulsive is dangerous. Can you talk to me about what you meant by that?
Yeah. Again, you know, whatever flashpoint moved people, and it moved millions and millions. These flashpoints that we've seen over the last year have moved millions and millions and millions of people. And I'm very encouraged by that. So again, whether that was the death at the hands of the police, or whether it was COVID-19, which continues to rage on, and we continue to see these disparities grow, and in terms of, like, you know, deaths and access to care and vaccines and all these sorts of things, whatever the thing was, or whether it was the insurrection just a couple weeks ago, whatever the thing was, we professionally, but even personally, like, constantly get these calls and outreach of people saying, like, what can I do to help? Like, what can I do to help? What can I do? And we caution people from that, right? And it gets back to the uncle thing. I cannot tell you how many people have come to me and where we've met in person when it was safe, or get on the phone and say that, you know, I want to be a part of your work. I want to be in your army, but I'm not here in my official capacity, whatever that is, as a funder, as a journalist, as a banker, as a healthcare professional. And that's always quite concerning to me, because one, I don't get to, like, turn off the parts of who I am, and really none of us do. But I think it is rooted in this belief that, like, well, this work of anti-racism or racial equity, this is my personal work, but over here, like, that's my professional work. And we know that we can perpetuate and uphold inequity in our professional spaces, right? So, like, that bifurcating who we are and our identities, splitting up our identities is a part of that danger, right? Because it's about, you know, my individual acts and not, again, our collective acts, which is what upholds the system and the structure. But also, to the point I was making earlier, it is dangerous because it puts more labor on the people who are already oppressed, right? And it can be quite misguided. It can mean, you know, it's like any disease. If you misdiagnose the disease, you're not going to treat it appropriately, right? So that's for us why our trainings and workshops are so essential, because we don't know our history. We don't know what got us here. We're not using the same language, right? So it would be like doctors operating on someone for, you know, a life-saving operation, and none of them speak the same language at all. None of them had the same training. So how they're gonna go about, you know, replacing the heart could take that person's life. And that's what we're doing, right? Like, we are coming to this conversation not knowing a lot, not feeling comfortable about it, but like ready to act. And that's why that's really dangerous. And again, it's not about intentions, right? Mm-hmm. Like, folks are well intentioned, but we don't want to make the problems worse by not understanding the difference, for example, between diversity and inclusion, or racial equity and inclusion. It's anti-racism, it's all these terms. And I think importantly, to not only ground ourselves in our history, which is important so that we understand our truths and facts, but also to understand the manifestations of structural and institutional racism today. Right? Because that's the other thing that we see a lot. And I think back to your question about like pitfalls, right? Is that, like, even when folks get more comfortable having conversations about race and racism, people, and this is people become like the equity police or the racism police, right? They're like, well, that's racist and that's inequitable. And but they're not able to identify it in their own sphere of influence, right? So in your own workplace, or in your own system or sector, in your own community, in your own life, right? And so I think it's why we so often hear about this one crazy uncle, like, oh, I'm not racist and my family's not racist. I mean, I have this one uncle, right? But like, those are the conversations that we need to kind of go deeper on, because we can't isolate racism, I think, in the ways that we have.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely a lot of work to be done when it comes to being self-aware, and also acknowledging and understanding and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Yeah. Having those conversations, and also knowing the time and place to have those conversations, because as you said, it's not fair for white people to put the burden on their non-white colleagues, non-white friends, counterparts, whatever. Mm-hmm. It's not fair. Mm-hmm. We've got to go out there and we've got to get the information, do our best. And that's why things like the ThirdSpace Action Lab exist, which we're very, very thankful for. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Do you have any parting words to share here for people listening that want to be anti-racist?
One, we believe deeply in the sanctity of all humanity. I often have people ask me, am I anti-white? I'm not anti-white. I am pro-Black, right? Like, I want to live in the society where, like, slogans or campaigns, as people understand them, and movements as I believe, like Black Lives Matter, wouldn't be important. I want to get to the colorblind society that many people thought that we had arrived at when President Obama was elected. That was misinformed, right? Mm-hmm. But I want to get there. And so it takes us all. It takes us acting. It takes us taking steps. I really encourage people to not also be intimidated in these conversations by, like, the moonshot intervention, right? Like the big thing that you can do that'll, like, get a lot of change, but just what it means to check in with a human being, every day. I tell my white colleagues, especially, how much it means to me after another incident of police violence, or just anything that we see on the news, for someone to check in with me in the morning and say, like, hey, Ev, how you doing? How you feeling today? Right? Like, because that's what I would do for people around me, especially people for whom I've built trust and built relationships. And so, like, I would just check in with the human, right? And it's not this check in with the human in the way that we often, I don't see color sort of stuff, but, like, check in with the human if that's the direction that we want to go in. So I encourage people to read, to watch, to have rigorous conversations that we know are going to be uncomfortable, but establish some boundaries or guardrails in those conversations, so you can take self-care. Like, white folks have got to take care of yourself as you're having these conversations. Like, know your release valves and, like, where you can go for more information, and the people who would invite those conversations with you. I encourage people to come to our training. We do the training every month, and that's available on our website. And, just kind of stay plugged in and stay proximate, and importantly, stay encouraged, right? Because that story that I always reference about slavery, the fact that we ended chattel slavery for the most part in America, gives me, and it may seem strange, but it gives me hope, right? Like, we can do this. It wasn't just slaves running away. It was white folks along the way that, like, hid folks in their basement and risked their own lives. So we have this in all of us to do. It's not going to be easy, but it's why people got to just stay encouraged.
We are certainly capable. There is no doubt about that. We can get there. I do believe that as well. I absolutely agree with you on that. I want to let people know where they can connect to find out more about the work that you do at ThirdSpace Action Lab. Where do they find that?
Yeah, you can visit our website, www.third3rd, the word space, actionlab.co. We're hippie, so no M at the end. Or you can follow us at ThirdSpace Clee on Instagram and Twitter. So we try to stay really active in those spaces. If you go on our website, we have like the training schedule and other resources, and check out our newsletter where we're always sharing some nuggets and sharing some examples of that like radical imagination and vision that we want to see. So
perfect. And I will link all of that in the show notes too, so everyone will have access to that. It'll be linked on WKYC.com as well. Evelyn, thank you for making time to talk through this today with us on the Three Things to Know podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. So appreciate you.
Evelyn's message to stay encouraged really hits home for me personally, because that's what we have to do. We've got to keep the faith that we are making forward progress. We are doing our best. We are moving in the right direction, and know that that forward progress really is on all of us, because it can be kind of disheartening to see things that we don't want to see happening in the world, but we can't let that shake our resolve in this area. And what Evelyn said about an anti-racist world being for all of us, that really was eye-opening for me. I'm not sure that I had been thinking about it in that way. To be honest, to think about it in that way kind of feels a little bit selfish to me right now. But then I think about the kind of person that I want to be in this world, and the world that I want to live in, and the other people that I want to engage with, whether those be white people or black people, indigenous people, people of color in general. Yeah, I want that. I want that anti-racist world. So yeah, we do benefit from that. I think about the kind of experiences I want to have, the kind of world I want to raise my future children in, and the experiences I want them to have. It makes a lot of sense to me. I also want to share another resource, that resource that Evelyn mentioned, that book, How to Be an Antiracist. That's by Dr. Ibram Kendi. That's linked in the show notes, and that will also be linked on WKYC.com so that you can easily access that. I've heard a lot of great things about that book. Definitely not the first time I've heard it mentioned. New York Times bestseller, as she said. So great place to start if you're looking for something to pick up and get a little bit read up on this concept that's not a new word, but is a buzzword that we are hearing a lot more recently these days. Okay, now it's time for what you need to know in NEO. And this week, I have a guest star joining me outside our usual 3 News family for this one, here to tell us what we need to know in NEO about the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio is one of its program directors, Caitlin Hawkins. Caitlin, thanks for being here on the 3 Things to Know podcast.
Stephanie, thanks so much for having me.
So the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio is something that has been around for a long time. Can you talk to us about how it started?
Absolutely. So we started in 1927, so over 90 years of serving the Northeast Ohio community as the National Conference of Christians and Jews. And so we've been around for over 90 years, always with the mission of eliminating bias, bigotry, and racism to create communities where people feel connected, respected, and valued. Since then, in 2010, we changed our name to better reflect the immense diversity of the types of programs that we were doing and the types of social identities that we're addressing. And so around that time is when we changed our name to the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio. And we are a part of the National Federation for Just Communities, which is a federation of organizations all over the United States that do similar work that we do. So not only do we have an incredible local organization, but we also have the support of best practices from all over the nation.
And what we've been talking about today is specifically anti-racism. And I understand there are anti-racism programs available at the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio?
We do have a plethora of opportunities to discuss racism in terms of workshops that we facilitate, as well as engaging in anti-racist practices in your organization, in your school. So on our Shift consulting team, which is our professional services arm, we have the anti-racist organizational toolkit, and this includes surveys and pre-workshop kind of work that you do before a workshop, and as well as an entire racial equity and justice series, as well as the opportunity to engage with our team of consultants around a policy and procedure analysis from an anti-racist lens, and serving our school and our school and youth team that serves K through 12 schools and the students in them and the adults who work there. We have an anti-racist organizational toolkit as well that can serve kind of the wider school, as well as opportunities for students to engage in these conversations as well. So we have a wide variety of programming to address anti-racism and to work towards our mission of eliminating bias, bigotry, and racism.
And you touched on there, I just want to make this point for people because I think this is an important distinction to make as well. You do work with companies and major organizations here in the Northeast Ohio area. You do work with schools here in the Northeast Ohio area, but this is also something that individuals can do on their own, right? Even if you're not a part of one of those groups that are doing this as more of an organized effort.
So we typically don't do kind of open call programming. We have had partnerships with other organizations in the past where we've done sort of those open registration courses. Typically our clients are organizations, businesses, government agencies, as well as schools. So that way, one thing that is really powerful, I think, about our programming is that we provide opportunities for folks to have these conversations in their context. So within the organization in which they work every day, within the school that they work or attend every day. And that is one way to initiate real changes, having these conversations in the context with the people that you're seeing every day.
But there are resources available that people can access on your website, for example. Is that right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We do have some resources on our website. One of my favorites, actually, we have a pronouns how-to page, and that is related to kind of learning about gender identity and pronouns. And we link to that in all of our email signatures, actually, at the Diversity Center. So you can always learn more about that.
And really, the Diversity Center, like everything else, has really had to pivot now. A lot of times these events would be happening in person, but how are people able to access these programs now?
Appreciate the recognition, Stephanie. Since last March, we have completely pivoted our programming to being in a virtual context. So what that means is that we provide our workshops, pretty much the majority of them, including our anti-racist workshops, to organizations. And while it's not something that folks can necessarily log onto our website and join a workshop, it's something that we can contract with your organization. So that's kind of one way that folks can begin to engage in these things in their organizations.
I also want to point out, too, 3 News has been a media partner of the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio for quite some time. Our anchor, Russ Mitchell, has been on the board. Your president, Peggy Zone Fisher, tells me since he arrived in Cleveland, he has been on the board. And we also do another event with you annually. It is happening this year, again, a little bit differently, the Walk, Rock, and Run event. Can you tell me just a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up, Stephanie. Yeah, so we have our annual Walk, Rock, and Run event. And that is normally held at the Rock Hall on the first Saturday in May. However, last year we had a bit of an adaptation, obviously. We didn't want a bunch of people gathering. So we had a Facebook Live. I believe it was also live on other streaming sources as well. And so Peggy kind of led us through the walk at that point. And so it hasn't necessarily been called yet as to what type of walk we are going to have this year as one of our primary fundraisers for the Diversity Center. But we know that we're going to have some sort of event, and I really hope that we can all meet in person together again.
Wouldn't that be great? That would be truly wonderful. Now, Caitlin, before I let you go, let people know where they can go to learn more about the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio.
Yes, so to learn more about the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio, please visit our website at diversitycenterneo.org. If you're interested in connecting directly with someone who you can talk to about our programming, you can email programs@diversitycenterneo.org.
What about social media, Caitlin? Where can people connect with the Diversity Center in that way?
You may connect with the Diversity Center on our Facebook. You just look up Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio, and you can find some updates about our programs, as well as the other comings up in terms of events like the Walk, Rock, and Run at the Diversity Center.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today, Caitlin. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you, Stephanie.
We are very lucky to have the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio accessible to us here in our area. Also, lots of great resources at the ThirdSpace Action Lab, so make sure you check that out too. And that brings us to a good follow. And this week, your good follow is a 3-for-1. We are talking about a creative studio here in the Cleveland area, and also the two makers that run that studio. So the studio is called YeloBlu Studio, and the two artists that make up that studio are Randall and Cheryl Cochran. So here are their Instagram accounts. YeloBlu Studio is YeloBlu Studio. Randall Slaughter is Randall with 2 L's _ Slaughter. And Cheryl Cochran's account is Cardboard C like the ocean, SEA. Of course, as always, this will be linked in the show notes, but I want to make sure that I say the accounts for you so that you can hear them, as you're watching this. Now, these accounts, they're really vibrant, beautiful, bright colors, lots of line design, and it's just like their work. Very, very pleasing to the eye, and the pieces are abstract and unique, just like all of us. The reason that I'm recommending this to you, the way I came across these artists, is their work was on display at one of the downtown Phoenix Coffee Company locations. It was beautifully decorating the space, available there for purchase, and I had to start following them. So those accounts again, YeloBlu Studio, YeloBlu Studio, Randall Slaughter, RANDALL _ SLAUGHTER, and Cardboard C, CARDBOARD SEA. A good follow. You will not be disappointed if you add those accounts to your Instagram feed. That's it for this week. Make sure you come back next week, because next week we will be, if you can even believe it, in the week leading up to Valentine's Day. So we are going to be talking about some very lovey things. I have a very interesting, very educated guest joining me. It's Dr. Gary Chapman, and he is the author of The 5 Love Languages, The Secret to Love That Lasts. So that's a New York Times best-selling book, by the way, for 10 years running. So he'll be joining us to talk all about the love languages, how you can better express the way you like to be loved, and how you can learn how your partner wants to be loved, and all of that good stuff. Love, 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 love. The week leading up to Valentine's Day. So don't miss that for sure. And if you like what you're hearing on the 3 Things to Know podcast, I would love if you would subscribe to the podcast, leave us a rating, which many of you have been doing. Thank you for the ratings. Absolutely appreciate it. But you know what I would really love are some reviews. So if you could just take a moment, leave a little review, let me know what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear it. Send me a DM if you do, _ Stephanie Haney, and I'll respond to you. I'd love to know what you're thinking. All right, that's it for the 3 Things to Know podcast this week. I will see you back here next week talking all about love. I'm Stephanie Haney.
Thanks for listening to 3 Things to Know with Stephanie Haney from WKYC Studios. Subscribe now to stay in the know.